Okay, well, maybe wait a few minutes while people join, and then I will kind of put up, I have like some slides to kind of go through so everybody can see those.
Oh.
Yeah, and we've got the chat, so if you have questions at any point, feel free to say them out loud or throw them in the chat if that's more comfortable.
And I just made you a co-host.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so you can actually share your screen.
Sweet.
Hey, Brony, don't bark.
Okay. Can you all see those slides? Or, well, it's just one right now. Okay, great. Good. I'll just wait like another minute. We'll get started.
Yeah, thanks for doing this.
Yeah.
I'm excited because I don't really know what's happening. I'm ready to see everyone's quilting masterpieces.
Yeah, I want to see if people have tried it out, see if they've made. All right, well, why don't we get started? Hello, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining me. I'm excited to be here. My name's Alanna Stapleton. I'm an illustrator and textile artist and educator based in Madison, Wisconsin. I also work in arts programming at the student union at UW-Madison, so it's a lot of titles. But I make a lot of different kinds of work with different mediums for different audiences for different reasons, which has been confusing at times to define like what I do, but I think I am starting to really embrace that I don't just do one thing, and that's a good thing. So yeah, embracing lots of titles has been my thing lately. So I have a BFA in illustration from Northern Michigan University and my MFA in visual studies from Minneapolis College of Art and Design. So that's how I got to know my friends at SooVAC working from Minneapolis. So thanks for inviting me to be here tonight. So this is kind of a little bit of what I am going to talk through today, a little bit about me and my work, then share kind of how my quarantine quilting habit developed over the past few months. I'll talk you through my instruction art meditative quilt pattern that I wrote, and what I made with it, so you can kind of get to see my thinking and process behind that. And then hopefully some people will have brought things that they've made from the pattern and are willing to show and tell, share what they've made, and maybe tell us a little bit about their experience. So that's the plan for tonight. Yeah, I'll start out with, these are some examples of my illustrative work. Much of my work showcases lots of bold colors. I like to use hand lettering and explore everyday experiences, especially the humor found in them. I'm really interested in the connections between objects and memory and making the ordinary more meaningful. I work both like digitally and traditionally. I like the sort of urgency and shareability of working digitally, but also really embrace the kind of tedious and tactile nature of embroidery or other kind of traditional mediums. So it really just depends on the project, if it's personal, if it's for a client, if I have a lot of time, if I have no time at all. So all those things kind of factor into whether I'm using embroidery or digital mediums, but they still kind of occupy the same brain space for me within my illustrative work. So all of these interests have kind of led me to examining a lot of processes, and especially processes that have to do with the everyday and the seemingly mundane. And looking at lots of processes has helped me to like embrace my role as an educator and get really excited about that kind of work. So some examples of that, my MFA thesis work was making an embroidery kit with patterns and an instruction booklet, so really breaking down a lot of processes there. The embroidery piece on the right was from a show at the Textile Center in Minneapolis called Artists in a Kitchen. So it was pairing women artists with women chefs, so breaking down the process of making donuts. And then the bottom two images are from workshops that I've taught. The one on the left was a zine workshop I taught with Zoe Snell at SooVAC, and the one on the sort of in the middle there is from an embroidery workshop at the Bubbler at Madison Public Library. So as like an educator, I'm really interested in exploring accessible creative practices and methods for creative play, and also like meditative based making. So I'm getting to see that like role as an educator as an integral part of my artistic practice rather than a wholly separate one, as I've kind of viewed it in the past. So how do quilts fit into this practice? It might seem a little bit out there. You know, these quilts I've been making don't really have a like representational or figurative stuff within them. But in reality, I've been sewing my whole life, and quilt design has often influenced parts of my illustrative work. So quilts have been a part of my life for a long time, but I'm starting to come back to them. Sitting in a sewing machine was a big part of my childhood. My grandma sewed, my mom sewed, my sister sewed. That skill really like anchored me to the women in my family, and but it wasn't really a hobby that as a kid I embraced or chose. It wasn't really my space. I made a lot of clothes that didn't really fit me, from fabrics that I didn't like how they felt or looked, and from patterns that, you know, I wouldn't have considered my style even if I couldn't identify what my style was. But in my kind of final year of undergrad, I sort of realized like you have this sewing skill and you know how to draw, so you can design and draw the things that you want to sew. So that sort of, it finally clicked for me, and it just brought this whole other level of personality and a personal aspect to my work that helped me like connect with a whole other audience, and that has really been a driving force behind a lot of my work since then. So this March, the things have been happening. The world kind of went into lockdown, and I was just about to start a new job. I moved back to Wisconsin, moved into a new apartment. Lots of things were happening, and then all of a sudden not happening. And I needed a way to channel all of this anxious, nervous energy. And that's kind of where the quilt making started. I needed a place to focus this anxious energy, and I'm really a project person. I need something to work on at all times, something to do with my hands. And I had all this time. I knew I needed to be making something, but I didn't really know what to say, and that's kind of where you know, I turned to quilt patterns, things other people had designed. So kind of the one in the upper right here, the Clava quilt was designed by a maker called Miss Make. So, you know, sewing lots of curves. And then the one in the bottom left is a pattern called Modular Blocks by Pearl Soho. So when I was quilting with my machine, I was really looking at it from more of a practical standpoint. I just moved into a new apartment. I didn't really have any blankets. So these are both like lap-sized quilts. And I was just kind of sewing and making all the time. But I, needed to push forward with that and do something else once those were finished. So my illustration work really starts with like message and context and having an intent. I draw when I like have something specific to say. But quilting really comes from like intuition and impulse for me. So illustration is like this means for communication, but quilting is really when I need to make something, I turn to my sewing machine. And I get to really think just about color and shape and balance. And so it, I can kind of be in a different headspace than when I'm working towards conveying a message in a way that I really need to and want to. So it becomes much more meditative and helps me like ground myself and access what I'm really thinking and feeling if I, can't define it in any other way. So this quote is one that has been a big part of everything I make over the past few months. Finding I could say things with color and shapes that I couldn't say any other way, things I had no words for. So if I were to come up with a recipe or a formula for the quilts I've been making, I would say it has to have these three things within it. So starting with some kind of structure. And I think of structure not as like limitations, but as a framework to play within. So that I can play inside of. And since I'm the one making the rules and setting the frameworks, that also means that I can change them whenever I need to. So it's not something that, confines or like restricts what I'm making. It really helps me feel more able to play within it. So how that often shows up in these quilts is coming up with my like limited color palette. I sort of start with, minimum 3 colors and build from there. And then I'm really only working with those fabrics kind of the whole time. And it helps me to get away from the infinite possibilities, I guess I would say. Then the next piece is improvisation. They're made based on impulse and intuition. I just pick out fabric. I don't plan them. I start to cut and sew things together. Maybe I start with one triangle and then another, weird angle, and how do those two things look together? So it's really cutting and sewing and cutting and sewing and fitting the pieces of the puzzle together as I go. So I would say when I say meditation or meditative making, I'm really talking about that headspace that like you're working on a project and it's just like total tunnel vision. You lose all track of time. You just have this like impulse to keep going. And that's really what I mean by meditation. I'm so focused on what's in front of me, or sewing those next 2 pieces of fabric together, or finding how to make them fit, that I'm really relaxed and not really thinking about anything else. So I'd say that's what I think of when I say meditation. My mind's not really blank. I do sort of ponder different things based on what's going on, but it really is this like intensely focused kind of state that I think about. So putting these quilts together is really like a collage and a puzzle. Each one I make, I learn something new about what I like. So I'm learning a lot about my like preferences, seeing that I enjoy moments of really high contrast next to moments of really low contrast. It's helping me to like curate a fabric collection that I really enjoy. I've been buying a lot more like subtle tonal prints. You can see some of these, like the white here, you can see has a really subtle like white pattern on it. So I'm really attracted to those kind of fabrics right now. Shout out to my local quilt store, Blue Bar Quilts. And if you're in Minneapolis, Knit and Bolt is a great local quilt store. So support your local quilt shop if you're buying fabric. That's just my little plug for small businesses. So far, I haven't really been able to predict outcomes for these quilts. I never really know what's going to happen when I start cutting and sewing. Sometimes I feel like it's done very quickly, and I make a small little quilt like this one. Other times I'm making lots of pieces and kind of finding how they fit together. Like this last one took me a lot longer. It was a lot more moving parts. And I thought was gonna look a lot differently than it ended up looking. So yeah, I don't really predict it. I can finish one in a day, or I can take a whole week to kind of put it together. At the beginning of quarantine or lockdown, or however we define this time, I was making like lap size quilts and quilting all the pieces together on my sewing machine. But with these sort of smaller ones, I returned to hand quilting everything. So you can see sort of all my hand stitches, putting all 3 layers together of the quilt. And that, you know, has kind of called back to the practice of embroidery for me. I get to spend time like physically knowing each quilt, holding it in a different way as I like stitch all the layers together. So that's kind of why I've done more hand quilting with these as well. So now I want to talk a little bit about the pattern that I wrote, the instruction art and meditative quilt pattern. So where did this come from? I had all this time and energy, and I'm a project person, and patterns were really the thing that were comforting to turn to. But also I like to do whatever I want. So I wanted to make a pattern that could guide you, but also left a lot up to interpretation. I was really inspired by the tradition of instruction art. So artists like Zola Witt and Marcel Duchamp and Yoko Ono and Miranda July have all done different types of projects where they write instructions and people have to interpret them to make that art. So that could be drawings and installations or performances. So writing a set of instructions and letting someone else complete that art. Another example I really like is the illustrator Yumi Sakugawa. She's writing these really interesting Instagram lists. So if you're interested, I would go check those out. They're great about like mental health and wellness and lots of existential thoughts. So I really love her sort of instruction lists. With improv quilting and this like idea of meditative making, it's pretty escapist, and there is like an inherent privilege in that to be able to turn off the problems of the world. And I want to acknowledge that, but I also think that it can be a great exercise for rest and recouping from the hard work that you might be doing out in the world. So that's kind of where that like improv and meditative making, I kind of brought all of those things together into this quilt pattern that I wrote. And I wanted to write a pattern that acted both as like guided meditation and instructions for making a quilt, but were also accessible to people who didn't sew. So I was really thinking about it as color and shape and visuals being pulled together. They didn't necessarily have to be fabric. So when I said the word quilt, I really meant sort of being inspired by traditional quilt design, not necessarily that it had to be 3 layers of fabric stitched together. I also wanted these prompts to help makers think more deeply about the mundane and the everyday. We are going through lots of transitions. Our daily life has changed a lot. And so what a good time to kind of take a second look at your daily life and what's going on and what's happening. So these are the different topics of each of the prompts in the pattern. I really used my own kind of day to break down and see what was bringing me joy, what did I think I needed to take a second look at, what did I look forward to, what did I maybe avoid? And those are kind of how I came to these different topics. So rhythm and sound, movement, taste, humor, time, touch, connection, space, and place. So now I'm just going to kind of walk you through each of these prompts and steps and talk a little bit about how I made each of these decisions. So this first one is about that structure that I talked about, you know, kind of coming up with my color palette and being able to work within that. So I had you choose your color palette by choosing a photo that meant something to you. So this one was from a day that I spent while on a trip to Lisbon, and I really loved the color of that blue sky. So I picked out a similar blue fabric, and then I built a color palette around that blue. And what I was liking, I picked a couple subtle prints and then a bunch of solid colors. The first one, the first prompt is about what kind of noises are a part of your daily life. Are you listening to a certain album on repeat? Do you have kids that are laughing and crying a lot? Is it like a podcast you're listening to a lot and you can't get that like podcast host, like the cadence of their voice out of your head? What sort of things are, what are you hearing every day? And I based mine off of the volume button when you like hit it and it sort of beeps going up, those like tapping sounds of it like growing and getting louder and getting quieter. So that was kind of how I came up with the visuals for this block. Because I was doing a lot of, I couldn't hear someone on a video call, or my music was way too loud, or it was way too quiet. So a lot of hitting that button, volume button. This next one is about movement. So I wanted you to consider what kind of movements were a part of your day. Probably different than the movement that has been a part of your day. You know, maybe if you're sitting a lot, and if you can, maybe go for a walk. That could be around your neighborhood, that could be just around your house. But thinking about, why did you take the route that you took? Is it different than one you always take? I'm really fascinated by the concept of labyrinths. So like walking a planned path to the center and then back out again. So I was thinking a lot about like a walk I took a lot and why I was always taking that same path with no reason. So thinking about that kind of planned path and unraveling that. Also, you'll notice a lot of my blocks are kind of based in traditional quilt blocks, and that's just the sort of design that I like. Your blocks can look however you want them to. Again, I'm using fabric and I'm sewing them together, but collaging, drawing, painting, you know, you can really use whatever materials you want to make this together. Taste. So what were you hungry for while you're working on this project? So again, this is another one of those that can totally change based on when you're attempting to make this block for this project. When I made it, I was craving something citrus, so I made a star because that reminded me of the word bright, like the flavor of something really bright. Was why I went with a star shape. With this one, I am really fascinated by humor. I like the humor in the everyday. A lot of the content I consume, I like to be funny or humorous in some way. So that was kind of why I brought this one out, considering like what makes you laugh. Some of the other prompts were really focused on a visual or sort of an action, and this one is a little bit more about you know, putting on something that makes you laugh while you make. So the visual isn't maybe totally connected to what you're laughing at, but you're making it while you're laughing is the idea. The next one has to do with time. And when we're in moments of chaos, time can kind of shift and change the way we interpret it or understand it. So with this block, I had you sort of look at what time it was, set a timer for 30 minutes, and make a block within that 30 minutes. So a way to kind of come back and understand how long is 30 minutes, because we might not have a good concept of that anymore. This next one is about touch. So I asked you to pick an object that you touch every single day and trace the silhouette of that object, and then use that shape to base your block around. So mine was the bottom of the coffee mug that I drink from every single day. This one is all about connection and connecting with people. So I wanted you to think about a friend or someone important in your life and reach out to them, get in touch with them. That could have been a phone call. You could take the time to write them a letter. You could just send them a text that you're thinking about them, whatever kind of works for you in the moment or for that friendship, but to use memories of that friendship to create this block. So mine is in this like pinwheel shape. I was thinking about the cyclical nature of friendship and its sort of long-lasting, continued presence in my life. And this last one is all about space and place. So, you know, you've probably been spending a lot of time maybe at home or in a single space, and you know, thinking about what do you like about that space? What do you maybe not like about it? If you were really experiencing cabin fever, what's a place you've been dreaming about being? And to design a block based around the role of space and play in your life. So I was thinking a lot about nature and kind of being surrounded in it. So that's sort of why I have this like curved shape of the green, kind of engulfing the other like chaos pieces quilted together. So once you made each of those 8 blocks, the idea is that now you get to put them all together. So this pattern works if you only want to reflect on one of these prompts. It works if you want to do a couple of them, and it works if you want to do all of them. So again, this is based on what kind of experience do you want to get out of it. So here is kind of showing you the process that I went through to put these together. Now that I had these 8 different blocks, and I needed to think about what did they mean. Did I want there to be some sort of narrative element to how they got placed in the final piecing of the quilt? Did I just want to go based on visuals? You know, that's how it looked best. So the sort of 3 images at the top are kind of the different iterations that I tried, realizing that I was also going to have to fill in some of those blanks too. So, you know, I could have gone back and done one of the prompts a second time. I really just filled it in with other scraps of fabric that I had used from the other pieces. So sort of the one that I ended up settling on, you'll notice that my block for connection and my block for food are the 2 largest blocks, and they sort of anchor the quilt. And those were the things that were most important to me on that day, thinking about my friends and eating, which is always one of the most important things to me. So that's kind of how I thought about the like narrative of this quilt, as well as balance, thinking about those large blocks and how they could bring the quilt together. So this is sort of what it looks like at the end. You know, once I was done piecing it, then I put it together with the 3 layers to sort of finish this quilt and hand quilt it all together. Got to spend more time with this product that I'd made in that like physical getting to know it as I quilted the pieces together. So now I'd love for you to share some of what you've made, or if you have other questions for me about anything I talked about, I'd love to answer those. These are just some prompts maybe if you're not really sure what to say about what you might want to share. So really just kind of, I'd love to hear you describe your experience. What went well about the pattern or following the prompts? What did you find difficult or was hard to kind of get through? How did you feel after you'd completed a block versus when you started? Did any of the prompts really resonate more deeply with you? Do you like what you made? Do you hate what you made? And would you try it again? Would you try to make something totally different the next time around? So just some things to think about and talk about if you're prepared to share. So I'm gonna stop sharing the presentation here. Oh, I don't know if that worked. Okay. All right, is there anyone who is interested in sharing what they've made? You could pop it in the chat. Oh, we've got a question here from Carly. Were there any parts that you made that I didn't love at first when they stood on their own? That's a really good question. I think, let me think about the different blocks. I think when I started to, it wasn't so much the blocks on their own. It had to do more with when I started to put it together. I wasn't sure I liked how it was looking all together. And so moving those around and thinking about the narrative aspect of it helped me kind of fall in love with the final product. That's a good question. Has anybody, I understand that like time is hard. Not everybody has like gotten a chance to maybe try it if they want to. Is anybody maybe looking forward to try it, or maybe to try not sewing, but with another medium that they might attempt it with?
I am looking forward to trying it.
Yeah.
You described it beautifully, and it seems really lovely. And for my own practice, like I love the idea of that repetitive sense of time, like sort of slowly repeating and building things up. I've never made a quilt before, and I'm not too much of a sewer. I was actually just doing this as I was listening to you. This is like I'm making a bunch of roots. There'll be thousands of them, and like this is my repetitive motion that I do.
Yeah, you can definitely like apply that to this concept. Like I wonder if you could, like you're making what you're making, but thinking about some of those prompts.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, like it doesn't necessarily have to look like a quilt, but you can still be like pondering those sort of moments of your everyday and letting that like influence how you are like making those roots. Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't considered that. That's awesome.
And if anybody wants to, you can tell people they can unmute. I went and muted some people because there was some background noise, but.
Yeah, if anyone's got a question or a comment or want to share something, feel free to hop on. Hi.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I have a question. Your quilts are beautiful. I love how abstract they are and how kind of ungeometric they are.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering just about how you actually end up piecing them together, like how you fill in the spaces. Like, are you measuring? They seem so kind of random. And at the same time, I know from doing some quilting that it's so complicated in terms of piecing them together. So I'm just wondering a little bit about that process.
Definitely. So it is very random to start with. So I'm making these like bigger sections. And then as I sort of show in the, that last slide of how I move those around, I sort of start to see what's going to fit together perfectly. And I kind of sew those parts first. And then as it gets like tighter and tighter, I do start having to measure the sort of smaller pieces to make things connect. So sometimes that gets a little bit more complicated if I haven't done everything on like blocks that are all going to fit together. You know, sometimes I have to do like half of this gets sewn together, and then I have to go back and sew another part in. So it's not necessarily a beautiful process sometimes when I have to figure out how those pieces fit, because I'll like, no, I want this to go here, but then I haven't quite figured out what goes underneath it yet. So yeah, it does start out really sort of general and then gets tighter and more like technical and measured as I really fill in those little blanks. Yeah. Yeah, Carly.
Mine kind of relates to Rachel's question.
Yeah.
I saw that you had kind of a cutting board down in terms of like using a grid. Do you have any dimensions in your head when you're doing certain prompts? Like, oh, this one will be kind of a 5x5 square and I'm going to work within that as the structure. And then half of that maybe for the next one. Like, because although you say that you pieced it together, when you showed the final one, I was staring at it. I was like, I can't even find where she added things. Like it looks so intentional.
That's a good question. I think it sometimes starts with if I have a scrap of fabric that I'm going to use, like what size is that piece of fabric? And then what do I like cut that together with? Or yeah, or I think with the like one on connection and friendship and the one on food, I knew that those were blocks I wanted to be bigger. And so I did intentionally like cut each of those pieces to be larger. Or like with the star, I did add a border right away because I knew that I wanted that one to even be a little bit larger. So I think I was considering the like importance of the topic to me as I was making. Yeah, it's a good question. I think that happens more so with this one specifically, just because each of the blocks like have a meaning and go along with the prompt. Whereas when I'm just kind of doing straight like improv quilting, it definitely is just more of what feels good, what looks good. You know, sometimes I, with the smaller quilt that was like pink and green and had some of those like stars, that one was a little bit smaller. And I did sort of start out with like, I knew I wanted to make like an 8x8 block, and then I made another 8x8 block, and then I sort of found balance in 4 of those. So that kind of did start out with a dimension, but that just like felt good at the time. I can't really explain why I wanted 8x8. So how many of these quilts have I made currently? Okay, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, I have 6 like this that were sort of these like improv quilts. I've made 3 from patterns. 2 of them are like larger. So at least 10 over like since March. So a lot. So we have another question. How important is tactile quality of the fabric to your selection of materials? I would say it's not a huge consideration, but I do have some fabrics that have a sort of more like stubby weave, and I like how they look visually. It's not so much about how they feel. I do just like that the weave is a little bit more visible than some other like tighter weave cottons that I use. So I'd say the visual kind of means a little bit more than the tactile. And I think that's because I see these as more often wall hangings rather than like lap quilts. Yeah. Any other questions?
Do you make lap quilts?
Yeah, so I made the like kind of first 2 that I showed that were like from patterns. Those are like lap quilt sized. So I definitely have. they kind of take up all the space of the floor in my apartment, so I can't really go much bigger than that. Because I don't have a place to lay it out to prepare to quilt it. So I sort of, that's another one of my constraints, is this is all the room that I have to work. Have I ever experimented with mixed fibers or combined my quilting with my embroidery? Yes. So I, not this year, but last year, I did kind of a collaborative project with my sister, who is also a quilter. And she and I kind of worked together on some quilts where I would embroider on pieces of fabric, and she would kind of quilt them together, or she would quilt a block and then I would add some embroidery to it. I don't have any photos of it handy, but we did do some experiments with that. So I haven't done a ton, but we did make a few quilts like that. I would like to do more of that too. Yeah. Again, when I sort of have a narrative I want to buy in to. Yeah, I should share those. We haven't really shared those with a lot of people, so I gotta get on that.
And you could email them to me and I could put them on your webpage where your pattern is.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Gotta take some pictures.
there you go.
Good. Awesome. Does anybody else have any other questions? Yeah, Carly.
So I don't sew. I mean, I can,
Yeah.
but it doesn't bring me joy.
Right.
Often.
I understand.
So it's more of a necessity, but I have been like doing more collage work, and because of the space constraints that I have, just working smaller.
Yeah.
And what am I getting at? Oh, I'm curious if anyone has ideas about any sort of contact paper or some sort of kind of stick and peel substance or structure to lay down when doing collage for the kind of meditative quilt pattern.
Oh, that's a good idea. I feel like maybe not parchment paper, but I feel like there's like a type of paper that has like maybe wax on one side, or has that you can, I'm not sure. But
you know what I mean though, like having that down and then you'd be able to see grid lines under it. And then being able to kind of like move pieces around.
Yeah. That's a good point.
I don't know, I'm just curious. That's kind of how I see it playing
make
out.
Your own.
Yeah.
For some reason, Post-it note tape is coming to mind. Like it's because you can lift it up and move it around. I accidentally used some recently on something that I thought, I didn't realize it was Post-it note tape, and then it started peeling up. I was like, oh, it's temporary adhesive. I'm Jen, by the way. Hi.
We're good.
I can sew. I've never made a quilt, but people around me quilt. I had a roommate when you were describing not having enough room in your place to lay out the quilt. Like I remember when she was working on the big quilts, and it was like, okay, that half the apartment's off limits for a while.
Yeah.
But I did in March, I started making fabric masks.
Yeah.
For everyone I know, and just was cranking them out and donating them. And so I found myself with a lot of small pieces of fabric that I love because I picked it out and I didn't have the heart to throw it away because it's like, I might use that couple of inches. So I just want to thank you for putting this together, and also for sharing tonight, because it's been really inspirational. And I'm thinking about like how cool it would be to work on a piece, just not like everyone's enjoying this time, but also to kind of memorialize it in like a quarantine quilt, since the fabrics I have on hand were purchased specifically for COVID
or
masks.
And to build something else that's like comforting and beautiful out of the scraps of something else that was not so comforting and beautiful.
Yeah, and I love your prompts and just being able to reflect on how those are unique to this time versus if I had sat and thought about them a year ago. So
Yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Thank you. I had somebody ask about if there were any quilt artists that I'm following that I like. I do have some. Let me see if I have their names handy here. There's someone named, her handle is Quilt Queen. She lives in Minneapolis. She makes a lot of really wonderful quilts. I like Patterns and Fabric by Carolyn Friedlander. I'm a big fan of fabrics made by a company called Ruby Star Society. Heidi Parks is one of the people that I was really inspired by. She also writes patterns that are really like up to interpretation. Hers are more like scavenger hunt style, kind of inspired by the like objects around you or materials you already have. Her sort of aesthetic is very different from mine, but she definitely kind of has also written patterns that are very like reflective, and you're able to like interpret them in a lot of different ways. So she's a Wisconsin-based textile artist and quilter. Other ones. There's, I also want to plug an organization called Social Justice Sewing Academy. They're doing a lot of great work with youth and social justice and textiles. So they're a great organization to follow. But we have a suggestion from Rachel. Interesting fabric artist quilter is Bisa Butler, someone that they really liked. Someone asked Tiffany asked if I prefer hand sewing or versus a machine. I'd say a combination. So I piece everything with the machine, and then I like to hand quilt, unless it's like a really big quilt and then I want it done faster, then I'll quilt with a machine. But I do prefer the look of hand quilting. Yeah, I think that's all I have. We're almost out of time. If anybody's got any last, Instagram artist, the artist who does the Instagram list, she's an illustrator. I'm gonna put her name in the chat. Let me make sure I spell it right. I think this is correct. Her name's Yumi Sakugawa. Okay. Well, thanks for joining and all your great questions. It's been really fun to share something that's like very personal and like gets me through the day, and get to think and talk about it, and hopefully bring some joy to other people. So thanks for being here. Yeah. If you have any further questions, feel free to email me or find me on Instagram. I'm always happy to talk about quilts and sewing and art and all of the above.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, Alanna. That's great. And also, if anyone wants to share this video tonight, it will be on SooVAC.org on Friday, and YouTube. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for coming, everybody. Really nice to see you all.
Thanks.